Imagine getting back to the dive boat after a dive. Your dive was very normal, you followed your dive computer to a T, but as you get onto the dive boat, you start feeling a little bit nauseous. You chalk it up to maybe having a little bit of seasickness. You're also a little bit tired, but hey, this is diving, you're in the sun, you know how it is, you can be tired when you're diving. A little while later though, you start feeling a little bit of tingling in your hand. And then you start noticing that your hand's going a little bit numb, and then finally, you start feeling some pain in your shoulder. Well, you might be bent, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. We're going to be talking about decompression sickness, the bends, and everything that you need to know. In this video, we're going to be talking about the bends, also known as decompression sickness. We're also going to be talking about what you need to do in order to avoid getting it, what to do if you do get it, and then also 4 very common myths that people have regarding decompression sickness, as well as 12 rules that you need to follow in order to avoid ever getting it. Before we start talking about the bends, we need to review a little bit of diving science. And the first thing that we need to talk about is the air that we normally breathe. Now, we all know that the air we breathe is comprised of 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. Now, what ends up happening is as we dive and we descend under the water column, we start to absorb more of this oxygen and nitrogen. And with decompression sickness or the bends, we're primarily concerned with the nitrogen that's being absorbed inside of our bodies. So every time we descend 33 feet or 1 atmosphere, 10 meters, we're going to be absorbing twice the amount of nitrogen as we were on the surface. So that means that at 33 feet, we're absorbing twice the amount of nitrogen. At 66 feet, we're absorbing 3 times as much. At 99 feet, we're absorbing 4 times as much, and so on. Now, this process of nitrogen being absorbed into our bodies is known as ingassing. So during the dive, you're going to be ingassing nitrogen. Now, depending on how long your dive is and what depth you were at, you'll ingas a certain amount of nitrogen, and now that nitrogen needs to come back out. And the way that that happens is as you ascend back to the surface. And this is what we call outgassing. So the problem with decompression sickness comes into play when you have too much nitrogen that's built up inside of your body. So let's visualize this another way. Imagine that this sponge over here represents your body. Now in decompression theory, they track many different tissues. Some might be your bones, some might be your skin, another one might be your organs, but we're doing a really simplified example here. So imagine that this sponge here represents your body, and the water represents nitrogen. Now at the surface, you have as much nitrogen as you can absorb already. But once you enter the water and you start to descend, you start to absorb more and more nitrogen underwater. And the deeper you go, the more nitrogen you absorb. Now, once you return to the surface and you have all this nitrogen that's been absorbed, that nitrogen has to leave your body. And that's essentially what happens when you are ascending and you come back to the surface from a dive. So now that you understand what ingassing and outgassing is, we can talk about decompression sickness or the bends. What ends up happening is if you go on a dive and you absorb a lot of nitrogen and you don't control the way that that nitrogen escapes your body, then it can actually form little bubbles inside of your bloodstream. And then depending on where those little bubbles end up in your body, you might exhibit different signs and symptoms, but basically it's going to wreak havoc on your body. So you might be wondering, why is it called the bends? And the reason why is because this was first discovered when workers were working on bridges in the 1800s here in the United States. So at the time, they built these airtight containers for the workers to be able to go down and help build the foundation of the bridges. And they noticed that when they were getting to around 50 feet or so, the workers were actually coming up with pain. And the pain was in their spinal column and in their joints, but they were actually bent over from the pain. And ever since then, the slang term for decompression sickness, because they didn't know what it was the bends. Now, unfortunately, once they got deeper to around 90 feet or so, some of the workers actually started to die. By the way, if you like this video, please consider hitting the like button, hit the subscribe button, and the bell notification. It really helps us out with the YouTube algorithm and to reach more divers like you. Now that we know what decompression sickness is, let's talk about some of the things that make you susceptible to getting decompression sickness. And the first and foremost, and this is by far the most important thing, is that you need to adhere to the dive tables or your dive computer on a dive. You need to make sure that you follow the dive tables or you follow your dive computer, any stops that it prescribes, and that you do so conservatively. Now, another factor that's going to make you susceptible to decompression sickness is your individual physical characteristics. Now, when decompression sickness is studied, it's done so on a bell-shaped curves. So that means that there's people on either end. There's people who basically can do anything and they may not get bent. And there's people who, for just about anything, might end up getting bent. And some of these things include your physical fitness, it includes just your individual biochemistry, and there's something known as a PFO, which is a small opening that you might have in your heart, and you may not even know you have this, but if you have this, you are a lot more susceptible to actually getting decompression sickness. Another factor that makes you susceptible to getting decompression sickness is if you're working hard underneath the water. Now, you'll probably remember from your science class that a solution will mix more easily when the liquid is warm. And that's essentially what happens if you start exerting yourself underneath the water. You're heating up your body and making it easier for nitrogen to be more absorbed into your body. Another factor that you need to be aware of is that if you're cold during a dive, you also are more susceptible to getting decompression sickness. And this goes back to the temperature and the way that nitrogen can come out of solution, because if you're cold, it's harder for the nitrogen to come out of solution, so you're going to have more nitrogen as you ascend and come back to the surface. Something else that can be a factor in you getting decompression sickness is also the rate at which you ascend back to the surface. Now, you've probably heard that if you ascend too quickly, then you can get decompression sickness, and that's actually partially true. It's partially true because if you don't have any nitrogen absorbed in your body or a significant amount of nitrogen absorbed, then you can't get decompression sickness. But if you have absorbed enough nitrogen and then you come up too quickly, that rapid ascend can actually force bubbles out into your bloodstream, and this is where you can get decompression sickness. The final factor, and this is something you've probably heard before, is dehydration. If your body is dehydrated and you don't have the normal fluids that you normally would have flowing through your bloodstream, then you can have more bubbles forming in that bloodstream, and that makes you more susceptible to decompression sickness. And this is the reason why it's important for you to both be properly hydrated and not do anything before a dive that can potentially dehydrate you. So now that you understand what some of the risk factors are for getting decompression sickness, let's talk about the signs and the symptoms of actually getting decompression sickness. Now, just as a review, signs are things that you see in another diver or another person that's on the boat, and symptoms are things that you feel in yourself. So let's first go through some of the symptoms, and we'll start with some of the milder ones and get into some of the more serious ones. First of which is skin itching. Now, if you come up from a dive and you start noticing that your skin's a little itchy, or maybe even you start noticing that you have a little bit of a rash, that could be a symptom of decompression sickness. Also, if you just start noticing that you're really tired, fatigue, that's another symptom of decompression sickness. Another classic symptom is if you start feeling that you have pain, especially in your shoulders for some reason, but if you start feeling joint pain just about anywhere, that could be a symptom of decompression sickness. Also, if you start noticing that your hands or any part of your body is starting to go numb, or you start feeling a little bit of tingling, that's another possible symptom of decompression sickness. And also, if you start feeling dizzy, you start feeling vertigo, a little bit of ringing in your ears even, those are all classic symptoms of decompression sickness. Some other symptoms, and now that we're starting to get into some more of the severe ones, is if you start losing sight. You can actually go blind, and this all depends obviously on where the little bubbles that start forming in your bloodstream end up. But if you end up losing your sight, you start going blind, this is definitely a symptom of decompression sickness when it's directly after a dive. Also, if you start losing the ability to move certain parts of your body, paralysis is another one. Then of course, if you have shortness of breath, chest pain, these are all things that are very serious and you need to get help immediately if this starts to happen. Now, let me know, have you ever been on a dive and had any of these symptoms or seen somebody having these symptoms? Let me know in the comments below. Now that you know some of the symptoms of decompression sickness, let's talk about the signs. These are things that you would look for in your dive buddy or another diver that's diving with you. The first of which, and we talked about this before, is if you start noticing somebody has a skin rash developing where they didn't have one before the dive. Also, if you notice that when they're walking around, they're starting to stagger, or they just have a weird walk to them that they didn't have before. Also, and this is kind of obvious at this point, if somebody suddenly collapses or they go unconscious, this could definitely be because they have decompression sickness. And then also, of course, we mentioned before, paralysis or weak muscles. They just have an inability to be able to move around the way that they were moving before the dive. Some other signs that you might notice is if somebody can't recall things that they should, so they can't remember details about the dive or something that you know that they should be able to remember. And then if they just start acting bizarre, have a shift in their personality, or just acting really weird, this can also be a symptom of decompression sickness. Now, when we talk about all the signs and symptoms of decompression sickness, you might hear the term thrown around, type 1 decompression sickness or type 2. And the only thing you really need to know about this is type 1 refers to musculoskeletal or a skin rash or a less severe form of decompression sickness. When we talk about type 2 decompression sickness, we're talking about neurological. So this is where somebody actually had paralysis or numbness, or they had that mental confusion. So the bubble ended up somewhere in the spinal column or by the brain and started to actually affect the neurological system of the diver. So I really hope you never experience these symptoms for yourself, or that you're ever on a dive boat where you end up seeing somebody who's experiencing these things. But what do you do if this does happen? Well, what you need to know is that this is where it's extremely important that you're diving with reputable operators that have equipment on board that's been tested regularly and ready to go, and also personnel that know how to use it. So the first thing that we need to do with this person who's experiencing decompression sickness is get them on 100% oxygen as quickly as possible. And the reason why is when somebody's breathing nothing but 100% oxygen, they're no longer ingassing or breathing in any more nitrogen, and it helps the body to expel the nitrogen that's inside their body out. Now, aside from that, you also need to get that person to get medical care as soon as possible. So depending on what part of the world you're in, you need to contact emergency medical services. Here in the United States, you can contact Coast Guard, you can call 911, but the point is that if you're on a boat, you may need to get the person actually out on a helicopter, you might need to get a Coast Guard boat to come pick them up, but you need to get the person, depending on the logistics, to a hospital as quickly as possible, and this is extremely important. Once you've contacted emergency medical services, the next thing that you should do is to contact DAN. Now, DAN is not a person. DAN stands for Divers Alert Network. And the reason why is these are expert doctors that deal in just diving medicine and hyperbaric medicine, and they can aid you in helping you know where the nearest facility that has a hyperbaric chamber is, if that's what you need, or just help the actual doctors and the emergency medical personnel in giving you the proper treatment for you to be able to get through this, or whoever the diver is, to get through the decompression sickness that you're experiencing at this moment. So you've contacted emergency medical services and you've contacted DAN. Well, what comes next? Well, this really is going to be a diagnosis that's going to come down to the doctor that's seeing you. And this is by no means medical advice. It's just for you to understand what happens. At this point, you're probably going to go to a hospital that has a hyperbaric chamber. This is a chamber where they're actually able to increase the pressure, and by doing so, allow the bubbles to shrink back down in size and come back out of solution in a controlled way while you're under that pressure. Now, it's extremely, extremely, extremely important that you get on the oxygen, that you call emergency medical services, because if you delay doing this, I want you to imagine that you have a bubble that's in your spinal cord, for example, and it's blocking passage of blood and blocking passage of, or actually pinching off the nerve. If that stays there long enough, it can cause permanent damage. And that's the reason why it's extremely important for you to get the aid that you need. And if you need to go and get into a hyperbaric chamber, that you do so as quickly as possible. Now, something else that I should mention while we're talking about the treatment that you would receive is that it's extremely important that all of us as divers carry DAN insurance. Again, DAN is Divers Alert Network, and they offer an insurance which basically would cover if you were to need to go to a hyperbaric chamber, and it also covers all other diving related injuries, and they have different plans. Some of them include diving insurance as well for trip insurance. But the important thing is really the hyperbaric or the medical part, because a lot of health insurances wouldn't cover if you needed to go to a hyperbaric chamber, and this can be extremely expensive. So you want to make sure that you can get coverage for this, and the coverage is relatively inexpensive. I'll leave a link in the description below to DAN and their insurance plans. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that I was going to give you 12 rules that you can follow to avoid getting decompression sickness. Now, it's important for you to understand something, and we alluded to this earlier. Even if you follow all these rules and you do everything that you're supposed to, there's always still a small chance that you can get decompression sickness. And that's again because we do everything on a bell-shaped curve, and there's certain predispositions that you might have physically that might make it so that you can get decompression sickness. Even if you've been diving 1,000 times before, on dive number 1001, that might be the dive where you end up getting decompression sickness. And this is actually one of my pet peeves, because we've been on dive boats where we've heard instructors talking to their students and saying, well, if you follow the dive tables, you won't get decompression sickness. And that's completely false. You can do everything according to the rules, be hydrated, be properly rested, do everything exactly the way you're supposed to do it, and you'll still get decompression sickness. However, if you follow these 12 rules that I'm going to show you right now, you'll significantly reduce your risk of getting decompression sickness. So let's talk about these 12 rules that you can follow in order to avoid getting decompression sickness. And we're going to first talk about the things that you can do before the dive. First and foremost, you want to plan your dive conservatively. What this means is if you're diving the dive tables, you don't want to take them to the very extreme of the no decompression time limit. And if you're diving a dive computer, when you're planning your dive with your dive buddy, you want to make sure that the two of you talk about when you're going to turn the dive, and you don't want to do so when there's hardly any time left on the dive computer. Now, for that matter, you also want to make sure that when you're going through the settings on your dive computer that you don't have it set to the most liberal setting, because obviously that's going to have it so that you have more chance of getting decompression sickness because you're exposing yourself to more and more nitrogen. Another thing that you want to be conscious of is your hydration level. So you want to make sure that you drink plenty of water the night before, and also for that matter, while you're on the boat, it's not a bad idea to be drinking some water before the dive itself and after the dive when you get back onto the boat. Another rule for you to follow is to dive nitrox. Now, If you're diving nitrox, this is a whole separate topic. You need to take a course to learn how to do so. But real quickly, just so you understand what it is, when you dive nitrox, what you do is you inject more oxygen into the tank, and by doing so, because there's more oxygen in the mixture, you reduce the amount of nitrogen, and that makes it safer for you to dive because you're ingassing less nitrogen throughout the dive. Now, something that's related to nitrox that's also really important is if you are diving nitrox and you're diving a dive computer, you need to make sure that you check your mix on your dive computer before you get in the water. Because if your dive computer thinks that you're diving nitrox, but you're in fact diving air, that can be completely catastrophic to you. The next rules deal with what to do during the dive itself. Now, I mentioned earlier that you want to plan your dive conservatively. Now it's time to actually dive your plan. So make sure that you follow the rules and you don't go to the very limit of your dive computer or the dive tables throughout the dive. Next, you want to make sure that when you're doing your ascent, you do so slowly. You don't want to come up any faster than 30 feet per minute or 10 meters per minute, and slower is better when you're doing your ascent. Next, you want to make sure that when you're doing your safety stop, you do the bare minimum of what your dive computer tells you. So your dive computer may tell you to do some deeper stops, but when you actually get to the safety stop, you want to do at least 3 minutes. And here, if it's safe to do so and you've got plenty of gas, it's never a bad idea to extend your safety stop, because this is time that you're outgassing nitrogen while you're still under pressure, and it just increases your safety throughout the dive. The next rules deal with what to do after the dive. Now, once you're back on the dive boat or you're back on shore, you want to continue to hydrate. And the reason why is because you still have nitrogen inside your body, and you're going to have nitrogen built up inside your body for many hours to come. So it's not a bad idea to continue hydrating long after the dive. Also, and this is something that I see that's often overlooked, you don't want to go skin diving after you've been scuba diving. And what I mean by this is where you go breath held, because the reason why is, imagine, now you've got all this nitrogen built up inside your system, and what are you doing? You're going up, you're going down, you're going up, you're going down, you're going up, you're going down, and that's the same as taking soda bottle and basically shaking it all up. And we all know what's going to happen when you actually take the cap and take it off. Another rule to follow is you want to make sure that you don't work out after you've been scuba diving. And again, this has to do with temperature. You don't want to heat your body up and accelerate the outgassing of nitrogen into your bloodstream. And the final rule, and this is also a warning, is you want to be very conscious of the signs and symptoms of decompression sickness when you get back to the dive boat or you get back to shore. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because it's not uncommon for people to deny having decompression sickness, to just chalk it up to being extremely tired or being nauseous. And treatment is very important. You want to get treatment as soon as possible. If you're at all in doubt, it's not going to hurt you at all to get on oxygen and to go to the hospital and have a doctor determine whether or not you have decompression sickness, because the worst thing that you can do is to deny it, go home, maybe go to sleep, have bubbles continue to form inside of your bloodstream, and now you can get into serious problems because you have no help nearby. So now that you know the 12 rules to follow, let's go through some of the myths, because I think these are also very important. First and foremost, you want to understand that even if you do everything right, you can still get decompression sickness. There's a myth out there that people say if you follow the dive tables or you follow your dive computer, you ascend slowly and you do everything that you were taught in your scuba diving class, that you'll never get decompression sickness. And as I mentioned before, this is a myth. You can do everything right and you can still get decompression sickness. It's not your fault. It's just part of your biology and part of physiology, and there's no shame in getting decompression sickness. What's important though is that you get treatment right away. The next myth that you need to understand, and this is also something I've heard many people say, is that you need to call Dan first. That's not true. Divers Alert Network, you definitely want to contact them, but your first point of contact is you want to get emergency medical services involved, because you're going to need help if you have decompression sickness, and they can provide more aid to you than a telephone call can, obviously. Another myth that I've heard many people say is that if you get decompression sickness, you can never go diving again. Now, this is obviously a medical diagnosis, and if you get a severe case of decompression sickness, a doctor may tell you not to dive again, but that's not always the case. I'd say probably in most cases you can continue to dive, but again, that's a medical diagnosis, and that's something that a doctor would be able to tell you, but it's certainly not the case that you automatically can't go diving again if you were to get decompression sickness. That's something that a doctor will need to determine, but it's very likely that you would be able to dive afterwards. The final myth, and this is extremely dangerous, is, I've heard this myth before and I need to mention it, is there's divers who think that if you put yourself on oxygen, the symptoms will go away and then they can just go home. This is extremely, extremely dangerous, because putting yourself on oxygen may mask the symptoms of decompression sickness. But now if you go home, remember, you're going to be outgassing for many hours to come. If you go home and now these symptoms start to express themselves, especially if they happen while you're asleep, this can be extremely dangerous because you may not have the medical help that you need, and now you could have gone straight to a hospital and it would have been a minor incident or maybe nothing at all that you felt once you got on the oxygen. But now, because you didn't get the aid that you needed, this can actually potentially be dangerous or even deadly. The last thing that I need to mention about decompression sickness or the bends is that it's extremely important that once you get back to the surface, you do not go flying for 24 hours. And the reason why is because even though you're done, even though you're back on the surface, you have to remember your body now has nitrogen, and for many hours to come, that nitrogen is slowly coming back out of solution in a safe manner if you followed all the dive tables or your dive computer. If you were to get into an airplane or actually go to altitude and go up a mountain, you're decreasing the pressure around you and you're forcing more nitrogen back out of your bloodstream. So it's extremely important that you don't go flying or go up to altitude after you've been diving. So now you know everything you need to know about decompression sickness, why it's called the bends, you know the signs and symptoms, and you know exactly what to do if you were to get decompression sickness. Is there anything we missed? Let us know in the comments below. By the way, if you got to the end of the video and you're also a diver, then you're probably going to want to download our free guide, The 4 Keys to Mastering Your Diving. It's over here on your right, and we're also going to put a link to it in the bottom of the description. This is a guide where we go into 4 simple things that you can do to be more comfortable, more efficient, and just a better diver overall the next time that you go diving. So you're definitely going to want to check that out.